Uh, Good morning, everybody. My name is Travis Gilbert. I'm the educator and collections coordinator here at the Old Baldy Foundation. And we're very excited to be bringing you some public programming the next few days or weeks while we are all in this together with the COVID-19 outbreak. Unfortunately, a few days ago, we had to close public operations here at Old Baldy Lighthouse for the safety of not only our staff and our volunteers, but all our wonderful supporters and all our wonderful guests that come back year after year to climb North Carolina's oldest standing lighthouse and to celebrate the history of this beautiful island. So again, my name is Travis, and I'm going to be taking you on a journey the next few days and weeks for Baldy Island's history here virtually, if you will. So today we're going to talk about one of the really most cool objects that we have in Old Baldy's archives. And I kind of get chills. I'm that big of a nerd every time I pull this document out because it brings in all the big players here to Baldy Island. We're talking about George Washington, we're talking about John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, all these founding fathers talking about Baldy Island. That's how important Baldy Island was during the founding of this nation in the late 1780s and throughout the 1790s and into the 19th century. So for you students out there who might be home trying to continue with life as normal with your schoolwork, there's one word I really want you to think about as we discuss this artifact that I'm going to pull out in a few seconds, and that is a primary source. So think about it. What might be a primary source? Well, first of all, let's take the word primary. So primary means first, as opposed to secondary, second. So if a source is primary, it is most likely someone that experienced the event, wrote about it, drew it, reflected upon it, maybe in the 20th century recorded it like we're recording it today, in the first person, meaning that they were there experiencing and witnessing the historical event, and they left behind some piece of history, whether it's a drawing or a writing or recording, for historians like me and historians like you to read, to observe, and learn about it. So a secondary source would be like a book. So Kevin Duffus, he wrote this wonderful book that is available in our gift shop, The Story of Cape Fear and Baldy Island. Now, Kevin Duffus, unfortunately, although I bet he wished he could experience some of these events, he was not here on Baldy Island when they built the first lighthouse. Kevin Duffus was not a soldier in the Civil War, but he is writing all about those events here in this book. Since he was not a primary accountant, since he didn't experience these events firsthand, rather secondhand, we call this a secondary source. So some big differences between a primary source and a secondary source. And we as historians try to use as many primary sources as we can because those are going to be first-hand accounts that tend to be a little more reliable sometimes than many secondary sources. I know when Kevin was writing this book, one of the first books written about Baldy Island by Ethel Herring in the 1960s, there were a lot of inaccuracies in her book. It's a wonderful narrative about Captain Charlie and some other folks that we're going to be bringing you to on this virtual experience. But Kevin had to go back to the primary sources and kind of correct some of these secondary sources that weren't as reliable. So the moment we've all been waiting for, or at least I have, I'm getting the chills already up my arms. This is one of my most favorite pieces in our collection. This is a primary source. This is the act passed by the Second Congress of the United States to establish a lighthouse on Bald Head at the mouth of the Cape Fear River in the state of North Carolina. And let me just read this to you. Second Congress of the United States, at the first session begun and held in the city of Philadelphia in the state of Pennsylvania on Monday, the 24th of October, 1791. An act for finishing the lighthouse on Bald Head at the mouth of the Cape Fear River in the state of North Carolina. Be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the Secretary of the Treasury, under the direction of the President of the United States, be authorized as soon as may be to cause to be finished in such a manner as shall appear as soon as available, the lighthouse, therefore begun under the authority of the state of North Carolina, on Bald Head at the mouth of the Cape Fear River in that said state, and that a sum not exceeding $4,000 be appropriated for the same, out of any monies appropriated, which may be remain unexpended after satisfying the purposes for which they are appropriated, or out of any other monies which may be in the Treasury not subject to prior appropriation. And it is signed by Jonathan Trumbull, who is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. It is signed by John Adams, who is Vice President of the United States, also serving as President of the United States Senate. And finally, for the final approval, President George Washington approved on the 2nd of April, 1792. And at the bottom, it is signed by the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. So let's break down what you see here in this primary document. And I will let you know that you may be self-isolating, you may be quarantined, but you may still access our collections online. You don't have to be here at Bald Head Island to access wonderful pieces of our collections like this act. You can go to our website, oldbaldy.org. There is a History and Archives tab on our main menu, and if you click that, it's going to take you to what I like to call the Facebook of history nerds. It's called eHive. There are a billion different eHives, like we have Facebook or Instagram or Pinterest or Twitter. We use eHive, and it is basically a social media site for all our wonderful pieces in our collections. So you can go into our eHive page via our website and see this act. You can see bullets, you can see the uniform behind me, everything that we have here in our collections that we take care of for you, our community, so future generations might know of the history of Bald Head Island. You can access from the safety and from the comfort of your own. So we encourage you to go to our website. So let's backtrack. Let's break down some of this. First of all, they say an act for finishing the lighthouse, not an act for completing a lighthouse. So finishing, that's kind of wild. So you're telling me that there was a lighthouse already here on Bald Head. Well, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And what's really great is we have a primary source that talks about that unfinished lighthouse. Pulled out a letter here to Alexander Hamilton from the Revenue Office in the Department of the Treasury. So Alexander Hamilton is all the rage right now with the new musical. Well, his first role in the new nation of these United States was to serve as President George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. And the Lighthouse Service, during the beginning of this era in American history, was underneath the Secretary of the Treasury. It was their obligation, their responsibility to maintain the nation's lighthouses. So his underling, his staffer here, is writing to Secretary Hamilton on the 31st of May, 1792, discussing that the state of North Carolina had started a lighthouse in the late 1780s. Is kind of odd how much he complains about the state of North Carolina and what they should have done and what they did not do. It seemed like the federal government had a lot of work on their hands. Let me just read. He lists basically for the Secretary of the Treasury 4 problems that the state of North Carolina had with this unfinished hump of brick sitting on our beach. Said, first of all, the ground underneath the base of the lighthouse was soft, it was sandy. You may be listening in from very far away, not in North Carolina, but all us North Carolinians, can tell you here on the coastal plain, you don't have to dig very far to find sand. And sand is not a very sturdy, it is not a very strong soil. So to build something as massive as an 80-foot lighthouse, you're going to need something a little bit stronger around the foundation other than sand. So that was the first problem of this unfinished lighthouse here on Bald Head Island. The second problem, he says that not only did they put this foundation for this unfinished lighthouse on sandy, soft soil, they made the foundation and the walls way too thin. And not only were they way too thin, they were made of a very soft clay that they formed into brick. So brick is made of clay, and you press it together and you fire it, and once you fire it, just like pottery, maybe in art class if you're a student listening, it makes it hard. Well, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. I remember being a student. I was not a very good art student in elementary school and middle school, and I had plenty of objects that I made in art class, different pieces of pottery, that would explode when you put it into the kiln. And that's clearly what is happening here at these North Carolinians, that they are not making this brick very proper, and the brick is not only soft, but it's way too thin at the foundation. So the third problem is another vocab word maybe for some of you students out there. What is a lanthorn? A lanthorn. He's complaining here that the lanthorn is made out of wood rather than metal. Well, you see, you have the lighthouse, that's the brick, that's the mortar, that's the tower that you climb up, all 108 stairs out there at Old Baldy. But once you get to the very top of Old Baldy, you got to climb up a ladder. Oh, there's someone calling, probably asking if we're open, unfortunately. But once you get to the top of Old Baldy, you eventually reach the ceiling of the lighthouse. And you have to climb up about a 9-rung ladder to get up into the room that sits on the top of Old Baldy. Well, that room is called a lanthorn. And, another way of looking at it is, rather than calling it this fancy word called lanthorn, we can just call it a lantern room, because that's the purpose of that room. It is to hold the lantern that's going to cast the light out onto the horizon and help all those ship captains find, for example, our purposes, the Cape Fear River, or ports and harbors all across America. Well, think about it, students, and anybody else listening in. If you make a lantern room out of wood, and we know that in 1792 they don't have electricity, so they don't have light bulbs, so they're basically lighting a bunch of candles up there. Do you see maybe what the problem might be? What if it's windy that day? What if the glass breaks? What if a keeper accidentally knocks a candle down? Now you have an open flame on a room that's made of wood. And let's say that wooden room, that lantern room catches a fire. Do you think that they have any pumps? Do you think they have any hoses that's going to be able to shoot water 80 feet into the air to extinguish that fire? Probably not. That would be a lot of running up and down the stairs to extinguish that fire. So it's a hazard. That's what this gentleman is writing Secretary Hamilton about, is why would they make the lantern or lantern room out of wood? It's a fire hazard. It needs to be made out of metal. And lastly, what he's saying about is it's not following all these other lighthouses that the nation is constructing. if you look at Cape Henry, which is a little bit north of us, it's near, maybe you're familiar with Virginia Beach, or perhaps you've taken a trip with your family to Colonial Williamsburg or Jamestown, the first successful settlement of the English colonies. The federal government built one of its first lighthouses at Cape Henry. And there's an old saying that you might be familiar with: if it's not broke, don't fix it. And let me tell you, that lighthouse is still standing up there at Cape Henry. So it wasn't broken. It has lasted all these years. And that's what this gentleman is complaining to Secretary Hamilton about, is that, these North Carolinians did not follow this tested, proven model or design to construct a lighthouse. So clearly the Secretary of the Treasury is not very happy with us North Carolinians. We did not do a good job trying to build that first lighthouse on Bald Head Island. And that is why the federal government came in and said, you know what, we're going to finish this job for you and finish this lighthouse that you've started on Bald Head Island. Again, in the year 1792. So let's break down a little bit more. So they're finishing a lighthouse. They're listing that they're going to appropriate $4,000. Another great, feature to look at is, in my job as a historian here at Bald Head Island, I often get people confused because this is a document that I show off pretty regularly. I'm pretty proud to be the caretaker of such a fascinating document that has Thomas Jefferson's signature on it. Thomas Jefferson is an incredible founding father. He had his faults that we're exploring as historians here in the 21st century. But regardless of his faults, Thomas Jefferson did some pretty incredible things in the founding of this nation in its early years. Well, a lot of people assume because Thomas Jefferson signed this document, it is Thomas Jefferson that commissioned or told the federal government to build the lighthouse. Well, not quite. Thomas Jefferson signs this document because he's Secretary of State. And that's basically like a secretary or a clerk. The Secretary of the Treasury is really the individual that's in charge of commissioning this lighthouse. The gentleman in the Treasury is not writing Thomas Jefferson saying that this lighthouse is not very good, that the North Carolinians tried to build. No, he's writing Alexander Hamilton. So because Thomas Jefferson signs this document, there's a misconception. A lot of people make a mistake thinking that Thomas Jefferson commissioned the first lighthouse on Bald Head Island, when in fact, we know through that primary source, it was Alexander Hamilton, and the buck stops with George Washington. He's President of the United States. Well, how involved was George Washington? I don't think President Trump right now is probably too terribly concerned about lighthouses. There are many other important roles that the president is fulfilling in this crisis right now. Well, that is not so with George Washington. George Washington was intimately involved in the construction of the first lighthouse on Bald Head Island. As President of the United States in the 21st century, we just assume that, the president hears very little about the workings of the federal government. If your problem is reaching the Oval Office today, it must be a pretty big problem that really is going to affect the workings of our lives as citizens and the workings of the federal government. Well, lighthouses were that important in 1793 that George Washington's signature is on so many documents related to the construction of the original lighthouse. And I just brought out several, again, students' primary resources. These are all first-hand accounts about the construction of that first lighthouse. Like this first one here. Somebody's got to come down and build it. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton is not going to come down and correct all the mistakes the North Carolinians made. So they asked a friend from the Continental Army, and you might remember the Continental Army is the army that served the Patriots or the future Americans during the Revolutionary War. So Jedediah Huntington was the customs collector in the port of New London, Connecticut. And a customs collector is a pretty big word, but basically he's the man that you're going to find when you pull your ship into the harbor, and you are going to pay him the taxes. You're going to pay the customs collector the federal government's share of your profits to use that port. So they're not familiar, President George Washington is not familiar with all the contractors, all the builders in America. He's going to rely on a friend, Jedediah Huntington, from the Army days, from the war days. And Jedediah, he has just the man for him. His name is Abishai Woodward. He's a carpenter, he's a wood maker, a wood builder from New London, Connecticut. Really great friend of him. And we have a document that George Washington is signing. That's how intimately he is involved in the construction of that first lighthouse. Jedediah is writing his friend George Washington from the Army days saying that I have just the man for you. Bring Abishai Woodward down to North Carolina and he will build you a lighthouse that you'll be proud of. And on April 18th, 1793, George Washington signs his mark saying that I think that we found our man. One of the funniest things about this document is he says, we may have found the man, but I think he's being paid a little bit too much. So clearly George Washington's trying to keep the costs of the lighthouse down. So they know what the North Carolinians did wrong. They know the man that is going to build the first lighthouse. Where are they going to build it? Well, they go to another friend from their Army days named Benjamin Smith. You may be familiar if you visited Baldy Island before. If not, let me educate you. As I say, the politically correct name for Baldy Island is not Baldy. In fact, it is called Smith Island Complex. The Smith gets its name from Thomas Smith. He was an early governor of the state of South Carolina in the late 1600s into the early 1700s. He's a public official, and he owns this part of North Carolina that includes modern-day Baldy Island. We call it a complex because if you visited here, you know that there are dozens of tiny little islands all around Baldy Island. So it's a complex because rather than one barrier island, we have dozens of barrier islands, 3 being pretty large. Many of the other islands are tidal, meaning that at high tide, I wouldn't want to be stuck on those islands because you're going to be sitting in some water. And then at low tide, it becomes a little more land. You might be able to sit down on it. When we go across the ferry, there's some barrier islands out in the middle of the river. It's always fun at low tide. People take their lawn chairs out and people take their umbrellas out and sit there for the 4 or 5 hours that there actually is an island. And then at high tide, they got to get back on their boat and go to the mainland because that island is now going to be underground. So Smith Island Complex. Well, Thomas passes it down through several generations of Smiths, the last Smith being Benjamin Smith, that just by chance served in the Continental Army with Jedediah Huntington, with Alexander Hamilton, with George Washington. So just as they called up their friend from the Army days to find a man to build the lighthouse, they're going to call up somebody that they know owns a significant portion of land here where the Cape Fear River dumps into the Atlantic Ocean. And that gentleman, Benjamin Smith, is going to deed about 10 acres of land to the federal government so they can finally complete this lighthouse at the mouth of the river. First of all, he deeds it to the state of North Carolina, and then they build that terrible unfinished lighthouse. So I pulled out another document that shows you the state of North Carolina, the governor of our state, deeding that land from Benjamin Smith to the federal government, because it would be very important for the federal government to own the land they're going to build a lighthouse on. So we have a builder, we have the land. What are they going to build the lighthouse of? We learned that that gentleman writing, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, had a lot of quarrels or problems with the way the state government had started this unfinished lighthouse. So most importantly, we need really good brick. Remember all those problems with the porous, soft brick on that sandy soil? Well, in a primary document, I know that they weren't very impressed with the bricks that we made here in southeastern North Carolina. We weren't very impressed at all. So what occurs is they're going to have to import brick the whole way from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I pulled out 3 receipts, again, primary sources. Just as you go to the grocery store today, students, and you get a receipt for anything that you've purchased in that store, well, the Secretary of the Treasury, he got a receipt for all the bricks that he is purchasing in Philadelphia and shipping down here. I have a receipt here for 33,000 bricks, 5,280 bricks, 20,000 bricks, all shipped on a sloop called the Sousa, a schooner called the America, and a brig called the Fortune. 3 different ships, a brig, a schooner, a sloop. They're all very technical, fancy words for different ships and the size of the ship and how many sails there are. But receipts here for all the bricks that they are sending the whole way from Philadelphia into the port of Wilmington to finish this lighthouse. So we have good brick, that fixed a problem. Remember that lanthorn? Just as a reminder, a lanthorn is the lantern room that sits on the top of the lighthouse. Well, the North Carolinians wanted to make it out of wood, and we discussed that that's a big fire hazard to make something like that out of wood. We need something made out of metal that is fireproof. So here is, again, the first president of the United States intimately involved in the construction of that first lighthouse, George Washington, writing Alexander Hamilton on the 25th of April, 1793, saying, hey, we found a blacksmith named Samuel Wheeler in Philadelphia, and he is going to make us a lanthorn. In fact, Mr. Wheeler, he made 2 lanthorns. He made one for the Baldy Island Lighthouse, and he made one for the Tybee Island Lighthouse, which is down outside of Savannah. Tybee Island, one of my favorite places on the eastern seaboard. Perhaps it is yours as well. So he's, Samuel Wheeler, forging 2 lanthorns, 2 fireproof metal lantern rooms that can sit on top of this lighthouse. So we have the man to build it, we have the materials, we have the land. By roughly 1794, they have completed a lighthouse. It's about 80 feet tall. It's made of this brick. It's the first lighthouse in the state of North Carolina. It's the first lighthouse here on Bald Head Island, all thanks to the Second Congress of the United States, of which we have this document in our archives. But you may have noticed, students and everybody else joining us, why do I keep using the past tense? What happened to this lighthouse? Because I'll give you a hint. This lighthouse that we've been talking about is not all Baldy. It's not the lighthouse that you all climb and us North Carolinians love and cherish today. So what happened? Well, we are a barrier island. And just as we were discussing that we are a complex of islands that change depending on the tides and the seasons and the winds, that foreshadows what happens. By about 1810, I pulled out a diary entry of an Army officer in this area, and he is writing saying that the lighthouse is collapsing into the Cape Fear River. They built that first lighthouse too close to the Cape Fear River. And as the Cape Fear River changes its course as it winds its way towards Bald Head Island, it begins encroaching or getting closer and closer to that first lighthouse. So by 1810, I call this a meeting of the minds. This gentleman is writing that The collector of the Port of Wilmington, Robert Cochran, again, the guy collecting the taxes for the federal government when you pull your ship into port. He's meeting with General Benjamin Smith, that man that donated the land to build the lighthouse. And Sedgwick Springs, he's the second keeper of this lighthouse on Bald Head Island. And on August 3rd, 1810, they are here on Bald Head Island searching for another place to deconstruct that first original lighthouse and rebuild a second lighthouse that we know as Old Baldy today, finished around April of 1817, making her the oldest standing lighthouse in the state of North Carolina, but the second oldest lighthouse in the state of North Carolina. She's a big old example of adaptive reuse or recycling, because they recycled a majority of those bricks that came the whole way from Philadelphia, and Mr. Wheeler's lantern or lantern room that came the whole way to Philadelphia, to rebuild a second lighthouse that you may know is pretty far away from the river. So clearly they learned their lesson. So I encourage you to go online via oldbaldy.org. Check out this document that I have the honor of taking care of. Check out many of the other documents that we're going to be sharing with you over the next few days and the next few weeks. Again, oldbaldy.org. Go to our History tab on the main menu and click Archives. You may want to join us this afternoon at 2 o'clock. We're going to go out, and I think we're calling it Touring with Travis. And we're going to go head out towards the Cape and take a look at a location on the island called Surfman's Walk. And has a fascinating history that's going to give me even more chills when I talk about it. So thank you for joining us. Wash your hands. Be well. Social. Isolate yourselves. Thank you for your support. Thank you for joining us today. And we'll see you all in the next virtual program. Take care. Thank you.